Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyses Film. Today I'll be looking at 1979's Alien, a great movie and possibly the owner of the greatest trailer ever made. Alien was written by some combination of Dan O'Bannon, Ronald Shusett, Walter Hill, and David Giler, and it was directed by Ridley Scott. Now, I'm excited to overanalyze Alien for a number of reasons. First of all, it is one of the most overanalyzed films of all time, so I'm really at home here. Secondly, Alien is really the first flat story that I've done, or as John York might call it, a two-dimensional story. In my previous podcast on In the Mood for Love, I said that a tragedy is a story where the protagonist doesn't change, but that is in a three-dimensional story where the character has a need that they must embrace, a change that they need to make. Alien, I don't think, has that. Rather than a test to see if someone can change, this is a test to see if someone can stay the same. And broadly speaking, that generally means some version of can they defeat the enemy or can they stay alive? Okay, fine Mark, but normally you go off on one about arguments and counter-arguments that I think give the film a narrative or thematic unity, and all that normally comes from the change that the character needs to make. So, in a flat or two-dimensional story, where does that narrative or thematic unity come from? Is it even necessary? Maybe we're just getting by here on thrills. That's certainly what Ridley Scott has suggested in the past. And so, with all that in mind, first I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. Then I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. So, let's begin with the 5 questions about the protagonist. Question 1, whose story is it? Or who is the protagonist, basically? Alien is famous for having its protagonist slowly reveal herself throughout, really. But by the end, there is no doubt that our hero is Ripley, a 30-ish warrant officer on board the long-haul flight of the spaceship Nostromo. Question 2, what is her life dream? Life dream here refers to what it is that the protagonist wants or is aiming to do when the film begins and the story has yet to properly start. Alien really has, appropriately, in statu nascendi characters, or characters in a state of being born at the start of our story. They are literally raised to consciousness for the story to begin. We know very little about these characters really throughout, but Ripley's beginning motivation is absolutely clear. Just like everyone else, she wants to get home. Question 3, what is her want? Want here is what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film, from the moment they really begin their journey until the moment they are at their most defeated. As such, it is generally a SMART goal, in that it is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, this is an interesting one. When does Act 2 of Alien actually begin, and when does it actually end? What question is asked at the start of the act and answered at the end? Well, there are a lot of different opinions out there, I can tell you. If you wanted to tell me that Ripley's want is to protect the crew, you probably could convince me. But when you think about Alien, what really marks Ripley out from the other crew members? Sure, I mean, she's, clearly the best, but, that's not very interesting. What marks her out, to my mind, is that Ripley is the one actually trying to figure out what is going on with Ash and Mother. Everyone else is either keeping secrets or completely uninterested in anything that isn't an immediate problem or them getting paid. This want begins with her deciding to decode the message 23 minutes in and ends with a conversation with Ash 26 minutes from the end. A perfect start and end point for our Act 2. Question 4, what is her need? Need is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story, or at least normally it is. This is a question that I'm really interested in and I'll talk about throughout Alien. First of all, because there are so many interpretations of what Alien is really about. Second of all, because this is a flat story. And so Ripley should already have her need, and the tension is, can she maintain it? That's really important here. The argument and counter-argument relationship is Basically, a counter-argument attacking the status quo and to see if the status quo can maintain. And finally, I'm really interested in this because either the need is something as simple as Ripley needs to survive, and who knows, maybe it might be, or it's something a little bit more thematically rich. So if it's Ripley versus the alien, what does that mean? What could that be? I'll leave you to think about that and I'll come back to it later. Question 5. Does she get what she wants and or what she needs? Surprisingly, for a film as dark as Alien, whichever definition of the need I land on, Ripley certainly does actually accomplish both her want and maintain her need. Now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, let's have a look at Alien's sequences. There is normally, but not always, 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. Now, interestingly, Alien actually has, to my mind, 11 sequences, which is unusually high for a film that comes in at 114 minutes. And there's one more note to make here. Ridley Scott referred to the final sequence as his 4th act. Now, when I read this, I initially thought, we'll see about that, Ridley. But, well, turns out you can say what you want about Ridley Scott, but the son of a bitch knows story structure. So, with all that in mind, let's go. Act 1 has our first 2 sequences, and the first one is always pretty much life as it is. And so here, immediately, we slowly snake our way through an empty Nostromo. The way this sets the mood is really impressive. Then a monitor lights up with a message. Somehow even that is already kind of menacing. Now, you could argue that this is the inciting incident, the event without which our story as it is would not happen. Or you could argue that we discover later on that the inciting incident happened before this film actually began, with the company making the decision to do this to the Nostromo. Much has been made, and justifiably, of how we are introduced to the characters. First waking from hypersleep as if coming to life, and then immediately bickering amongst each other. It's all very well done. But I would note that I think sometimes the sense that these characters don't like each other is, or can be, overblown. I think they're probably sick of each other, and then things get really bad. But they actually show time and again that they really do care for each other. Anyways, we follow Dallas in to talk to the computer, eerily called Mother. By the time he gets back, we've been in the mess hall, the halls, the Mother room, and the bridge. The rest of the crew figure out only that they are not where they expect to be, and nowhere near home. But then Dallas reveals that there's been some kind of transmission from a planet nearby, and they are to investigate. Just like that, we have a new tension, and we move into sequence 2 now, wondering something like, will the crew find the source of the transmission? And maybe I'm imagining things, or maybe I'm beginning to get a little old and crotchety, but it's really struck me in the last few years watching films that 70s films in particular, or maybe it's just older films, are so much more about process than films today. If you watch the amazing Day of the Jackal, so much of that film is characters figuring out practical steps to do something difficult. Now it's just basically Batman needs to be in a room. He's in the room. How? He's Batman. That's how. And so here, Alien builds considerable tension around the fact that they have to do this difficult procedure of landing on an alien planet. They manage to, but take not inconsiderable damage in the process. And so, the engineers Parker and Brett have to do some repairing, and Ripley follows them down. Captain Dallas, Executive Officer Kane, and Navigator Lambert depart for the source of the transmission, leaving Science Officer and definitely just a regular old human like you or me, Ash, behind to talk to Mother. Now, so far, most people would be hard-pressed to say who the protagonist of Alien is, But just before we end Act 1, and I think that's important, we're effectively told. Ripley heads back to the bridge and begins chasing her want now. She asks Ash if she can start decoding the signal, which, among other things, is going to lead to her and Ash's rivalry throughout the second act. At that, the excursion party do find the source of the signal, an alien spaceship. Executive Officer Kane says they must go on. The crew of the Nostromo have encountered some kind of evidence of alien life and decided to investigate. And so, by my reckoning, we end Act 1 and we enter Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. And right now I'm wondering, will the crew find alien life? Now, Act 2 generally begins with a what's the plan scene. Again, you could actually argue that this would make a lot of sense at the start of the next sequence, which is an argument for the act starting later, when we see the crew try to deal with the alien once it's on board. But our third sequence here really has two main elements, which might sound familiar. Some of the crew are in a spaceship completely out of their depth, where something bad has clearly happened, and Ripley and Ash begin to butt heads. Right after Dallas discovers a giant alien corpse that appears to have weird, outwardly bent bones, I'm sure it's nothing, Ripley learns that the signal was not an SOS, but a warning. And this is really important, and part of the reason I think we're already in Act 2 here, because Sequence 3, the first sequence of Act 2, is generally dominated by what we term refusal of the call. The protagonist is called to action, and she doesn't accept. And so, Ripley wants to go out after the crew to warn them, but she allows herself to be talked out of it by Ash.
Ash, that transmission. Mother's deciphered part of it. It doesn't look like an SOS.
What is it then?
Well, it looks like a warning. I'm going to go out after them.
What's the point? I mean, by the time it takes to get there, they'll know if it's a warning or not, yes?
And so, whether she would have made it in time or not, who knows, but she doesn't go, because she trusts Ash in this instance. And Kane, in her absence, makes one hell of an acquaintance. And so, having been attacked in the face by the facehugger, it's safe to say that they sure as shit have encountered alien life. And so that's our Sequence 3 tension answered. But before we move into Sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem, there is the other reason I think we're in Act 2 already. And that is that at the end of Sequence 3, we have the protagonist's first unconscious move towards their need, or the protagonist's acceptance of the call. And Ripley makes a big shout now and refuses to let Dallas, Lambert, and a stricken Kane back in the ship without quarantining. A few minutes ago, she let Ash talk her out of taking a difficult step to perhaps protect the crew. Now, she argues against the interests of her commanding officer and Ash in the interests of the greater good. It is a kind of transformation. But of course, Ash circumvents her authority, and Dallas, Lambert, Kane, and Facey the Hug Monster get on board.
Let's open the hatch.
Listen to me. If we break quarantine, we could all die.
Look, could you open the goddamn hatch? We have to get him inside.
No.
I can't do that, and if you were in my position, you'd do the same.
Ripley, this is an order. Open that hatch right now. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Ripley, this is an order. You hear me?
Yes, I read you. The answer is negative.
In the hatch open.
And so now I'm wondering, will the crew manage to remove the facehugger and save Kane? And so we enter Sequence 4. Alien is so damn good at moving. The sequences in Act 2 especially are all at right about 10 minutes. They enter the ship in minute 26, they examine the facehugger in minute 36, they realize the facehugger is missing in minute 46, and guess when Alien's most famous scene is? Minute 56. It goes on with remarkable consistency. Anyways, at minute 36, they examine the facehugger. And quite aside from some of the abstract symbolism we've had so far with the shape of the corridors and the doors and so on, this is where things really start to get overtly sexual. The facehugger has not only latched onto Kane, but it has extended an appendage down his mouth. Here is also where things start to really turn ominous for everyone, because when they try to hurt this creature, it bleeds acid. And so, on a spaceship where acid could burn through the hull, that basically means hurting this thing could do more harm than letting it live. It is a tremendous plot device. Now, you might notice a lot of these tensions have a lot of they in them. It really feels like the crew combined is trying to resolve the tension or question. But notice also how every sequence here has some movement in the story of Ripley and Ash. And so before we move on, Ripley now probes Ash on why he let this thing on board. And it's clear now that she is at least somewhat onto him. But then our plot lurches forward again. The facehugger disappears and seems to have left Kane in a stable condition. And so we wonder, will they figure out how to resuscitate Kane? And we enter Alien's fifth sequence. Now, we start this sequence not knowing where the facehugger is. And again, notice how practical, how focused on process this fairly long scene is. They spend almost 2 full minutes looking for Facey. But eventually, they find it. They discover that it's dead, and against Ripley's wishes, Dallas lets Ash keep it on board. Again, notice here another movement in the Ripley-Ash story in this sequence. And I'd say this is a midpoint in that B story, right before the midpoint of our A story. She confronts Dallas about Ash and finds out that at the last minute, Dallas's usual science officer was replaced with Ash. And she now declares that she does not trust him. Also, notice that Ripley is always right. Not only does she not trust Ash, but she also warns Dallas not to take off yet. Specifically, she states that they're blind on B and C deck. It's cut out in the final film, but in the script, this blindness is later referred to as why they're having such a problem finding Bursty the chestburster. Anyways, they do take off, and even though they're a long way from home, things might actually be returning to some kind of normal. And even better news, Kane seems to have made a sudden and shocking recovery. This all feels very odd, but hey, let's all forget our troubles by sitting down for one last nice big meal before hitting the freezerinos. And so here we are, the midpoint of Alien, and one of the most famous scenes in all of cinema history. The crew are still kind of annoying each other, but spirits are pretty high by now. And Kane seems to be okay, and he certainly seems to have his appetite back. But then, Kane starts sputtering, gagging, and retching. And everyone soon finds out why, in graphic detail, as the chestburster reveals how it got the name, the chestburster. So it turns out the facehugger was actually impregnating Kane, and there can be no question here that there has been some kind of male rape. And here at the midpoint, Kane has, in a grotesque, macabre kind of way, given birth to something that has a passing resemblance to the ugliest, fiercest penis you've ever seen. At least, I hope it's the ugliest, fiercest penis anyone's ever seen. Anyways, that's enough of that unpleasant thought. Let me move on to nice, reassuring story structure talk. The midpoint, lest we forget, is the character's first conscious move towards their need. And in all the films that I've studied so far, these key story beats should always be defined by the actions of the protagonist, a choice that the protagonist makes. Michael Corleone murders someone, for example. But here, Ripley is pretty much passive, you'll notice. This happens to her. Now, I have a theory for this. As John York states in My Bible, Into the Woods, a three-dimensional story is about a character who changes, but a two-dimensional story, like Alien, is about a character whose knowledge of a situation changes. And so, Ripley doesn't need to make an active move towards a character change. Rather, this is the most significant breakthrough for her knowledge of the situation. All of Alien leads up to and comes out of this moment. So, it turns out they could not actually save Kane. And also that they've got a pretty feisty little alien on board. And we're left to wonder, can they capture this vicious little thing? It's time for sequence 6, the closest thing Alien gets to a honeymoon period. The honeymoon period generally happens after the midpoint and is when the main character begins to act in accordance with their need. But here, even if things aren't exactly great, the crew now at least have a fundamentally much better understanding of what is going on, and they have a plan to deal with it. And hey, the thing seems pretty small, so why wouldn't they be able to capture it? But first, there's something else to note. Almost immediately after our main midpoint, we have another kind of minor moment which contains another staple of the midpoint, a foreshadowing of the climactic action. 57 minutes into a 113-minute runtime, the crew use the airlock to jettison a body. In this instance, it is the corpse of Kane. Once that's done, they decide to go hunting Alien. They split into teams and we are introduced to the trackers. Now, we follow Ripley and the two engineers, Parker and Brett, as they very slowly hunt and discover Jones the cat, who I have a real bone to pick with. Jones runs off because it's a little bastard apparently, but also because there are scary humans around. And it's worth pointing out here that the honeymoon period is about to come to an end because Ripley makes her only real mistake. Assuming it's safe enough, she tells Brett to go and find the cat on his own. And he will, but something else finds him in the process. It turns out that Bursty the chestburster has turned into a terrifying 7-foot monster, the xenomorph. And Jones the cat, who scampers off at the sight of a 5-foot-something human, decides to stick around and watch this giant alien monster abscond with Brett. You're a real piece of work, Jones. Anyways, it turns out that the crew's plan really is not going to cut it, and what they're up against is a lot scarier and a lot more physically dominant than previously realized. And so we end the honeymoon sequence and we enter sequence 7 now, the first of 2 that will function as our bridge from the honeymoon period to the low point. We discover that not only Jones the sociopathic cat, but also Ripley and Parker the engineer saw the incident. And they've now figured out that the alien is moving around the air shafts. So Dallas comes up with a plan to drive it through the air shafts into the main airlock. Notice again, Ripley is now actively abrasive with Ash, and she pressures him into offering an idea that may actually be useful: flamethrowers. And there's another note to make here. Ripley volunteers to go into the air shaft. She is our hero after all. But, I think importantly for reasons I'll get into later, Dallas takes the responsibility for what feels like a suicide mission. And so we wonder, will they manage to pull off Dallas's plan? What follows is arguably Alien's second most iconic scene, and rightly so, it's so good. Dallas crawls awkwardly through a tight air shaft. Lambert picks up a signal, it's heading right for Dallas. Dallas can't see anything. He's in real trouble. The tension is something else. And then, well, no more Dallas. There's a deleted scene where Ripley discovers he's been kept alive in the alien nest as some kind of incubator, but in the final version of the film, we never actually find out what happens to him. But it's safe to say his plan did not work, and so we enter sequence 8. The remaining crew are really beginning to crack now, except for Ash, can't face that guy. Ripley is now in charge and she decides to continue with Dallas's plan. But first she wants to get some answers. So we wonder, will Ripley find out what is really going on with Ash and Mother? Ripley accesses Mother, and by asking the right questions and using overrides and just generally being interested, she learns that Ash has been protecting the alien all along, at the instruction of the company. Now, Alien is definitely a film that runs on vibes more than logic throughout, and boy does it work. But it really bothers me that we've just seen that the door to Mother makes a noise when opening and closing, and yet Ash just appears suddenly and silently beside Ripley. Ripley pushes him away and storms off, but Ash now considers her to know too much. He encloses her in the mess hall, and once again, things begin to get suggestive. We slowly discover throughout this scene that Ash is in fact a robot. Our first clue is that he appears to begin sweating, a milky substance. Again, this doesn't really make any sense, but moving on. According to Ridley Scott, as a robot, Ash does not have a sexual appendage, but has developed some sexual drives. It's probably worth noting at this point that this is the 70s, a decade that criticized family-oriented Star Wars for not being sexual enough. And so Ash grabs a porn magazine and tries to force it into Ripley's mouth as an expression of some inactionable sexual instinct, when he should really be killing her for the sake of his mission, and he's a robot carrying out an order, so all of this doesn't really make any sense, but moving on. Lambert and Parker discover the bizarre act taking place and eventually manage to stop him. In so doing, they discover that Ash is, for sure, a robot. A point I also feel that I should add here, Dan O'Bannon had nothing to do with Ash's character and regarded his addition as, and I quote, an inferior idea of inferior minds. He thought it was a needless distraction. There was also a needless sex scene where Sigourney Weaver gets naked that they ended up not shooting because the cast said, hey Ridley, this sex scene makes no sense. Did Dan O'Bannon feel the same way about that? Unclear. I really hope at some point though he lamented these idiots affecting the artistic integrity of his alien rape movie. The 70s. The remaining survivors plug this inferior idea of inferior minds back in and confirm what they basically already knew. But also, and this is thematically and structurally important I believe, that Ash admires the creature.
Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility.
You admire it.
I admire its purity. A survivor. Unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality.
But that's enough about Jones the cat. What about the alien? Now, I don't want to get completely bogged down here in structure talk, but I do want to get a little bit bogged down here in structure talk. This is the end of sequence 8, as we've answered our tension and Ripley has made the decision to blow up the ship now. By my reckoning, that means there are 3 sequences left. The 3 of them get ready for the shuttle, Ripley gets to the shuttle, and Ripley is on the shuttle. Now, normally Act 2 ends and Act 3 begins with only 2 sequences left, our false and true resolutions. And then I remember that Ridley Scott refers to the final sequence as his 4th act. And you know, god damn it Ridley, but I see it. Because again, what really gives the 2nd act of Alien its shape is actually Ripley versus Ash. Every sequence has at least some moment between the two of them. What's more, his speech here is really, to my mind, the thematic counter-argument. He tells them that they don't stand a chance against this beast. Ripley also now knows about as much as she's ever going to about the situation. And frankly, it doesn't sound good. And that feels like a fine time to end Act 2 and enter Act 3. So, Ripley, Lambert and Parker are the remaining trio and they decide to blow up the ship, and so we wonder, will all 3 make it onto the shuttle? Not bloody likely. Ripley heads to ready said shuttle, while Lambert and Parker get something sciencey from somewhere dark. I'm sure that'll go well. Then, famously, Ripley decides to go back and get Jones the cat. But you know, Ripley isn't a 7-foot acid spraying killing machine, so Jones the cat decides that he should run off again. As she eventually catches him, the alien descends on Lambert and Parker. Now, I want to talk about this scene in a bit more detail shortly, but for now it should be noted that the alien appears to go for Lambert, kills Parker when he gets in the way, and then, worryingly, really seems to take its time with the female. The last time we see her alive, the alien's tail is slowly wrapping around her and up between her legs. This, combined with the fact that the alien appears to have removed at least some of the pair's clothes when Ripley finds them, suggests, well, something that's best not thought about too much. And so, our tension is answered. Lambert and Parker have been slaughtered and perhaps defiled, and so we wonder, will Ripley make it to the shuttle? And enter sequence 10. Ripley engages the self-destruct mechanism and heads for the shuttle, but encounters the alien along the way. In her fear, she drops Jones and runs back to stop the countdown. She fails, and perhaps importantly, she calls Mother a bitch and attacks the terminal representing the idea. But there's nothing to be done, so she dashes back to her only chance of survival now. This time, the alien is not in her way, and somehow Jones the cat is completely untouched by this vicious killing machine. Are we totally sure that they aren't in league? Anyways, Ripley makes it on board the shuttle and takes off, getting clear just in time to see the Nostromo blow up from a safe distance. And it looks as though she has, against all odds, survived the alien encounter. But something feels off, doesn't it? She never actually faced off against the alien, which just doesn't feel right. The writer of Back to the Future, Bob Gale, once said that the audience has to know what must happen for the story to end. And we know, deep down, that Ripley must face the alien for this story to end. And so we enter one final sequence, Ridley Scott's fourth act. As Ripley prepares to go into hypersleep, she places the cat into the chamber and somewhat infamously strips down into her incredibly tiny and surely uncomfortable underwear. Also, they have remained remarkably pristinely white considering what she's been through. But anyways, Ripley is getting ready for hypersleep when she unwittingly discovers the alien, seemingly doing something very similar. Apparently, it's in its death throes here, and is actually in the process of turning itself back into an egg. Ripley gathers herself, slips into a spacesuit, agitates the alien out of its nook, and then, waiting for it to come closer, blows the airlock. The alien clings on for dear life, but, in full-on face-off now, Ripley shoots it with a harpoon, and then literally blows it away with the shuttle jets. And I love this final moment. She makes a report, and then gets into her hypersleep chamber. She woke to start the story, and now sleeps to end it. But, as she sleeps, the camera slowly closes in, leaving us with a faintly ominous sense over just how vulnerable she is.
Cargo and ship destroyed. I should reach the frontier in about 6 weeks. With a little luck, the network will pick me up. This is Ripley, last survivor of the Nostromo. Signing off. Come on, Cat.
So, there's two things I'd like to talk about with regards to Alien. First, this is the first outright horror I've done, I'd say, if you count this and not Jaws as a horror. But I am a total wuss when it comes to horror, and yet Alien doesn't really bother me at all. In my experience, Alien runs way more on tension than on outright fear or horror. And in terms of tension, Alien is just phenomenal. It keeps us in suspense all the way through, because the information comes through so slow and steady. It's 35 minutes in before we actually even see the facehugger, 56 in before we see the chestburster, and 67 in before we see the xenomorph. So there's actually only 45 minutes of film where it's the crew versus the alien proper. But it is still classified as a horror. So I'd like to touch on that idea a bit and why I think Alien is such a classic in the genre. Again, I'm not really a horror guy, but there's something I find interesting about non-human horror in my experience. It could just be the way I think about it, but anything involving a non-human antagonist generally feels to me like it's not really about death, but about some kind of domination. I once read that before the Enlightenment, tragedy was really defined by loss of life. After the Enlightenment, tragedy was defined by a loss of purpose. And in so many horror films, I think you can see this. It's not that you might die, it's that you might be subsumed. Vampires don't kill you, they make you a vampire. Zombies don't kill you, they make you a zombie. Your personality, your will, your reason, your personhood will be dominated and subsumed by something else. Well, just like Hitchcock said with The Birds that he aimed to highlight a fear that people didn't even know they had already, Alien ties this idea of domination and subsumption into something from real life, reproduction. One very particular way to look at childbirth is kind of horrific. Something grows inside a person, whether they want it or not, sometimes whether they know it or not, takes nutrients from that person, and then look out, because they are coming out. And then they require significant resources to grow. Whenever I talk to parents, they tend to say that they don't even remember the first couple of years really because they were so consistently sleep deprived. From there, the parents are pretty much genetically on the downward slope while the child is growing. Now, make that child a vicious alien, keep much of the rest the same, and you've got yourself some pretty good ingredients for a classic horror that implies something deeply unsettling for people. There's a reason why David Lynch took umbrage with Alien stealing aspects of Eraserhead here, in my view. But that brings me on to my second point. Because, reproduction is not a horror story, or at least it's not just a horror story. So that question I've been debating all through this analysis of Alien. Is there a real thematic argument going on within the story? Well, there is undoubtedly all of this stuff about sex, rape, and reproduction going on, but that tends to be expressed through the visuals or through the alien's actions, maybe. And what is the argument or counter-argument here? Sex might be a theme, sure, but it's not an argument as far as I can discern. And I think there is an argument. I mean, of course I do. I'm Mark. I overanalyze film. If a film as good as Alien was just a bunch of stuff happening, I'd have an existential crisis. Nevertheless, let's take a look at some of the basics here. Fundamentally, this is a question of alien versus humans. Actually, technically, it's alien and robot versus humans, but let's park that for now. So, is there a theme or argument in that? Well, generally speaking, if you want to know what the argument of a film is, especially in a two-dimensional story, one of the easiest ways is to look at the relationship between the low point and the climax. I regard Ash's revelation as the end of Act 2, and thus the low point, but it also works pretty well if you regard the deaths of Lambert and Parker as the low point either, for reasons I'll get to in a moment. But as I figure it, at the low point, Ash gives our only real description of the alien. It is devoid of conscience or morality. It is vicious. You could say it is devoid of humanity. So let's say that this is a film about a creature, actually creatures, that have no conscience or morality versus creatures that do. This is then what is tested. Cain dies because he's curious about other life. Brett dies looking for the cat. Dallas dies because he takes responsibility for the suicide mission. And most clearly, and importantly in the false resolution, Lambert and Parker die because Parker will not endanger Lambert to protect himself. She can't get out of the way, and he won't use the flamethrower on the alien while it would kill her. Parker then throws himself at the alien in order to protect Lambert, or to try to protect her at least, and they both die. But this is the false resolution. In the true resolution, Ripley survives the alien. Ripley, whose refusal of the call was to not go out and warn the crew, but whose acceptance of the call was to make a difficult decision in order to protect them. Ripley, who volunteered to go on the suicide mission. Ripley, who was alone on a ready shuttle and who went back for Jones the cat. Ripley, who ran towards the alien when her crewmates were in trouble. Ripley, who perhaps only sees the alien because she's looking after Jones the cat. And on Jones, the evil incarnate cat, having just been saved by Ripley, the cat is a distraction for the alien when Ripley runs right into it in the true resolution. Saving Jones the cat arguably in turn saves Ripley. And that is certainly the case in the script, where the alien is distracted by Jones the cat in the shuttle, allowing Ripley to blow the airlock. And further, Alien is of course not just Ripley against the alien, it's Ripley against Ash, a robot with no discernible conscience, but also against Mother, a parental figure that cares not for its children. And this is really what it comes down to. Look at the way Ripley looks after Jones the cat at the end of the film. It's no wonder James Cameron took the direction he did with Aliens. Ripley is already a nurturing figure. Alien is already about parenthood. And that's because reproduction is not a horror movie. It's not about creatures that take everything from each other and give nothing in return. It may be complicated, but sex and human reproduction is a wonderful thing because of conscience and morality and love, because of our humanity. That is what Ripley succeeds in maintaining. And despite the alien, the robot, and the computer mother, there's not much that humanity, perhaps never stronger than in Parenthood, will not overcome. This has been Mark Overanalyses film on Alien. It's been a while since I did an actually good modern film, so next time I'm really looking forward to looking at one of my favorites, Booksmart. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, and whatever else it is that's good for this kind of thing. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.